Hello and welcome to the second online session of this series, Research on Emotions from the Philosophy of Mental Health. My name is Ferran Molins and I am a clinical psychiatrist and I'm a member of the working group, Grup de Treball de Formació from the Associació Catalana de Professionals de la Salut Mental. We are a growing mental health professionals association in Catalonia with more than 200 members linked to the Spanish Asociación Española de Neuropsiquiatría. If you like our contents, do not hesitate to subscribe to our YouTube channels. We will leave more information of the association and how to become a member in the description. And today we are very grateful to have Professor Zoltan Kovacs with us, who have accepted to participate in these webinars. Zoltan Kovacs is Professor Emeritus at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. His main research interests include conceptual metaphor theory, emotion concepts, cross-cultural comparison, and religion and metaphor. And with that said, I will let Professor to begin his talk.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It is wonderful to be in Barcelona, at least in spirit, if not in person, because I spent some wonderful days and gave a talk about 15 years ago, and now it's a great pleasure to talk to you again. Now, as you can see, the title of the presentation today is The Old and New View of Emotion Concepts in Conceptual Metaphor Theory. Now, just to start off, we have to pay tribute to Lakoff and Johnson, who started conceptual metaphor theory, and in their first book on conceptual metaphor theory, Metaphors Will Live By, in 1980, they broke new ground with the analysis of some emotion metaphors, like love is a journey. This is probably the best known metaphor emerging from Lakoff and Johnson's work. Love is a journey, and you can see a large number of examples that I have taken from their book. Look how far we have come. We are at the crossroads and we can't turn back now, and we are stuck, and it's been a long, bumpy road, and the relationship is a dead-end street, and so on and so forth. So at the beginning, we have to make a distinction between what Lakoff and Johnson called a conceptual metaphor and the linguistic manifestations of that metaphor. So we distinguish between a conceptual metaphor and its linguistic metaphors. So when we talk about metaphor here, we use it in a systematically ambiguous way, either in the sense of a conceptual metaphor or in the sense of a metaphorical linguistic expression. However, the core, the heart of a conceptual metaphor is not the list of examples. They are important, but more important is what we call the mappings that provide a certain structure for the conceptualization of what we call a target concept. The target concept in this case is love. The source concept in this case is journey. And in generic terms, we characterize this set of mappings as systematic correspondences from the source domain that provide structure for the target domain. So here are the systematic correspondences. The travelers correspond to the lovers. The vehicle corresponds to the love relationship itself. The journey to the events in the relationship. The distance covered is the progress made. The obstacles are the difficulties in the relationship. Decisions about the way to go correspond to the choices about what to do. And finally, the destination of the journey corresponds to the goal or goals of the relationship. And you can see all of these mappings in the background when you see any of these examples. So it's been a long, bumpy road, is obviously based on the obstacles along the journey that correspond to the difficulties in the love relationship. Now, Lakoff and myself in 1987 did a joint paper on anger. And what we try to do is to systematically describe as many conceptual metaphors as we could find at the time with the methodologies of 40 years ago. And so that kind of research turned up, about a dozen metaphors, conceptual metaphors, like anger is a hot fluid in a container. These conceptual metaphors are followed by one or two linguistic metaphors that are instantiations of them. Anger is fire, anger is insanity, anger is an opponent, anger is a captive animal, anger is a burden, angry behavior is aggressive animal behavior, the cause of anger is trespassing, the cause of anger is a physical annoyance, to be a pain in the neck, and so on and so forth. Now, this paper, which was called, if I remember correctly, from almost 40 years ago, The Cognitive Model of Anger in American English, it was quite an innovative paper, considering the status of conceptual metaphor theory at the time, for some interesting discoveries and points that we made. In addition to the metaphors, we made an effort to find metonymies. Metonymies at the time were quite new in conceptual metaphor theory, but as we will see, they play a major role in the conceptualization of many target domains. So, for example, we found the body heat for anger, metonymy, Jim got hot under the collar. These are all conventional metonymic expressions. Some of them are metonymic metaphors. Some of them are metaphorical metonymies, but the point is that they describe some kind of expression of the emotion of anger, like red face for anger, internal pressure for anger, and inability to function normally for anger. The four indicates that this is a metonymy rather than a metaphor. Now, why was this so important to point out? By the way, this applies not only to anger, this also applies to love. We have seen the love is a journey metaphor, but also there are quite a few metonymies that characterize love, like increase in body heat stands for love. I felt hot all over when I saw her. Increase in heart rate for love. He's a heartthrob. Blushing stands for love. She blushed when she saw him. And so on and so forth. So we have a large number of them, like physical closeness for love, intimate sexual behavior for love, and so on. So this seems to be a general feature of emotion concepts that on the one hand, they are characterized by quite a few what we call conceptual metaphors, as well as quite a few conceptual metonymies. And these two lists very clearly indicate that. What the importance of these metonymies is that they provide what we can call metonymic motivation for the existence of metaphors. By metonymic motivation, we mean the embodiment, which is quite thoroughly and intensively researched phenomenon in the cognitive sciences. And, that paper with Lakoff was one of the first proposals to show one way in which embodiment can be found and pointed out in conceptual metaphors. So, for example, the anger is a hot fluid in a container seems to be motivated by the body heat for anger metonymy. So there is a physiological response in this case. Body heat increases when a person is very angry, and that seems to provide some amount of motivation for the emergence of the hot fluid in a container metaphor. Similarly, anger is fire is motivated by body heat for anger and redness in the face for anger. Anger is a pressurized fluid in a container by the internal pressure for anger. And anger is insanity, seems to be motivated in this sense by inability to function normally for anger, in the sense that when you're blind, or when you see red, or when there's a large number of such metonymies. They all indicate some kind of incapacity on the part of the intensely emotional person, and those manifestations seem to justify and motivate the emergence of certain conceptual metaphors. This is a big topic, and obviously I can't go into it in any more depth. Now, another important observation that we made in that paper with Lakoff was that a particular emotion concepts like anger is not characterizable by a single cognitive model or cultural model. I use cognitive and cultural model in the same sense, depending on where the emphasis is. When you think of it as a conceptual phenomenon, that you want to call it cognitive model. When it is more seen as more, context and culture dependent structure, then you want to call it a cultural model. The point is that there are many distinct but related cognitive or cultural models of anger, not just one. For example, you can have a cultural model of anger when there is an angry person and the angry person immediately explodes. So there is a cause that leads to anger and the person immediately explodes. Another cognitive model is when a person is angry and the person takes out his or her anger on someone or something who did not harm you. Notice that in the routine or in the default case, when you're angry, you want to do harm, you want to reciprocate, you want to retaliate the person who harmed you. But in this case, it is someone or something else. There is also the case where you successfully control your anger. Obviously, the routine case is when anger runs its full course. But here, you stop it by successful control. Getting angry without a cause, you notice that you are irritable all day, and you don't know why. This is getting angry without a cause. Being angry without expressing it. You are angry and maybe even intensely angry, but you do not express it. Again, there is something out of the ordinary about this case of anger. Getting angry but not wanting to take revenge. This is the case of turning the other cheek. Another interesting case of being angry is when you're angry at yourself. Notice that you are usually angry at someone else, and that someone else, is typically a person who did some harm to you of some kind. Now, I sometimes mention that these are cases or cognitive cultural models of anger that assume some background norm, some background case with respect to which they can be considered non-prototypical cases. So what then is the prototype? On the basis of linguistic evidence, we found with Lakoff that essentially in American English, people think of anger, this is their prototype, but notice that that the previous cases, and there are many other such cases, are non-prototypical cases for one reason or another. But the stereotype or the typical case, the prototype of anger in American English consists of a 5-stage model with the offending event and anger coming into existence. And then you're trying to control your anger. But in the prototypical case, you lose control of your anger. Notice that it is with respect to this stage of anger, the loss of, to which the successful control of anger is a non-prototypical case. And then finally, there is retribution, where you try to perform a retributive act against the wrongdoer. That is typically the person who made you angry to begin with. So these are some of the features of the early view of emotion concepts, and I have generalized these observations to the analysis of several other emotions in later books, like a book on love, like a book on emotion concepts in general, and um, and and um, and the book that I did in 2000 called Metaphor and Emotion. Now, we can turn to the more recent view of emotion, which is quite different in certain respects from the original, if I may say so, the original model that Lakoff and I worked on a long time ago. Now, if we turn from the specific anger concept to the general domain of emotion, then what we find are that what we find is that the general domain of emotion can be characterized by two causal structures. One causal structure is that the specific cases of emotion concepts bear out. A cause leads to emotion in the self, as in the case of anger, for example, when there is some wrongdoing and the wrongdoing makes you angry. And secondly, the second causal structure is that the self's emotion leads to a response by the self. Now, both of these cases are cases of causation, and we can make an important generalization here. Probably the key feature of emotion concepts is that they are characterized by causative structures like these two. These are the two most prevalent ones. And so causation seems to be a major aspect of emotions, not only of anger, but all emotions. Now, so how can we capture this causal structure of the emotions? In 1990, when I wrote Emotion Concepts, I noticed that Tommy's framework of force dynamics provides an excellent way of describing this aspect of emotions. The force dynamic structure offered by Tommy is based on physical forces and how one physical force interacts with another physical force. So if we try to describe the first causal structure, the cause leads to an emotion in the self, and we use Tommy's force dynamics, we can set this up as a domain, an emotion domain general metaphor, where the cause of emotion is a force. So we can have the source domain and the target domain, and of course forces, physical forces would be the source domains, and emotions would be the target domains, and the specific mappings or correspondences would be the following. You have forceful entity one that corresponds to a cause of emotion. Tommy calls this the antagonist. We don't have to worry too much about Tommy's terminology. Forceful entity two corresponds to the self. Now, there is some interaction between forceful entity one and forceful entity two. And that corresponds to the interaction between the cause of emotion and the person's self. Now, Tommy here talks about the idea that both forceful entities have a force tendency that characterizes them. The force tendency of forceful entity one is, in this case, the cause. The force tendency of forceful entity one is to try to change the object to which it applies. The force tendency of forceful entity two, in this case the self, is not to give in to the change that the force tendency of forceful entity one tries to achieve. And then there is some kind of result of the interaction between the two forceful entities, and that corresponds to the result of the interaction between the cause of emotion and the person's self. So in force dynamic terms, according to the prototype of emotion, just as in the case of the prototype of the specific emotion of anger, the result is that obviously some cause actually makes the self emotional. So as a result of this interaction of forces between forceful entity one and forceful entity two, the end result is that a person becomes emotional, a person becomes angry, let's say. So the important point here is that we characterize, in terms of a conceptual metaphor, the first part of the generic emotion scenario: a cause leads to emotion in the self. And in force dynamic terms, this is how we can capture that. Now, the second part of the emotion scenario is somewhat different. Here, notice that there is a change in the name. The cause of emotion is a force. Previously, here we were talking about the cause of emotion, but here we are talking about the emotion as a force. So forceful entity one corresponds to the self, and forceful entity two corresponds to the emotion. And it is these two entities, but this time corresponding not to the cause and the self, but corresponding to the self and the emotion, are in interaction. And as you can imagine, the end result here is that the emotion overcomes the self's resistance to the emotion, and this is why you lose control and you perform certain kind of retribution in the case of anger, or you begin to cry in the case of sadness, or you start to jump up and down in the case of happiness, and so on and so forth. Now, this gives us a generic, that is domain level cultural model of emotion, which looks like this. First, the cause of emotion that is characterized by a force tendency overcomes the rational self, who is unemotional or non-emotional at this stage, such that in the second stage, the self has emotion. That is, the cause overcomes the self. Okay, and then the self's force tendency overcomes the force tendency of emotion, and the self becomes emotional. Okay, this is the we can see two red two-headed arrows, arrows that point both ways, and they indicate two conflicts in the scenario. One is that the cause interacts with the self and the cause overcomes the self. And the second is that the self interacts with the emotion and the emotion overcomes the self. And then there is, as a result, there is some response. Now, it is for this reason that because the scenario contains both of these interactions, that we can generalize in force dynamic terms, the highest level metaphor in the emotion domain. Emotions are interactions of forces. And if we put it this way, it includes both the cause of emotion is a force and the emotion is a force metaphors. Now, let's return to the specific emotion of anger. The general mappings that characterize the emotion domain in the case of anger become more specific when we consider, the specific details of specific emotion concepts. In our case, let's continue with anger. And here is an example of a metaphorical linguistic expression that I found on the internet. It goes, everything that I wanted to say, I couldn't think how to say in French. I was bursting with anger, mostly at myself for my lack of French vocabulary. This is said by an American woman in Paris. The situation is clear. She is angry at herself, very much so, because she can't remember her French that she probably learned in school, a long time before this situation took place in Paris. Now, given that she uses "I was bursting with anger," we can assume that this is based on this metaphorical linguistic expression is based on anger is a pressurized substance in a container conceptual metaphor. This was one of the metaphors that we have seen earlier. And now this is another linguistic example for it. So, however, when we look at the mappings that characterize this metaphor will not be the general mappings that we saw for the mappings that characterize the emotion domain in general, but obviously they will be more specific. They would look like this. Here, the substance, I am talking about bursting with anger. The substance corresponds to the anger. The container corresponds to the angry person, that is the self. The pressure that the substance in the container exerts on the container corresponds to the intensity of anger, and resisting the substance pressure corresponds to the controlling the intensity of anger. Now, notice that we end up with an interesting observation. The observation is that given that emotions are interactions of forces, this is a domain level conceptual metaphor, on the level of the domain of emotions. And this is realized by a special case of that generic metaphor, which is this time anger is a pressurized substance in a container. And so here, the forceful entity 1 is a substance, forceful entity 2 is a container. the interaction is realized by some kind of pressure, and resisting the pressure corresponds to controlling intensity. That is, up to this point, the end result is that there is no loss of control. However, interestingly enough, there is a metaphor here that's even more generic than emotions or interactions of forces. And this is a metaphor that is causes are forces. Causes or forces can be called an imischema metaphor. This can be called an imischema metaphor because forces can be generalized as kinesthetic schemas. Force is a kinesthetic schema, and there are many other schemas, of course, image schemas, like the container image schema, like the verticality image schema that characterizes happiness up and down, and so on. So there are spatial image schemas, there are kinesthetic image schemas. Force is, of course, a kinesthetic image schema, and that is used in the causes or forces, extremely high-level metaphor. Now, what are the typical features of this metaphor? Well, the single most important feature of the causes or forces metaphor is that it provides experiential motivation for linking emotions and physical forces. Notice that, when you're trying to find out why in the generic level metaphor, emotions are interactions of forces, why you can ask yourself, why are emotions linked with physical forces or the kinesthetic image schema of force? The answer is provided by causes or forces, namely by the fact that forces are special cases of causes. When the wind blows and the leaves of trees are flying in the air, it is the wind, the force of the wind that causes them to do so. Now, we can say that either the cause of emotion functions as a force or the emotion functions as a cause. In both cases, the causes or forces metaphor is applied at the most generic level. So it is in this sense that it provides experiential motivation for why we can link emotions with physical forces. In addition, another feature of this metaphor, it has a basic schematic structure. The basic schematic structure is that a force affects an object with an effect. It can be leaves moving in the air. It can be, pushing someone into a hole. It can apply to many specific cases. And it can also apply to the emotions. Because if someone offends me and that makes me angry, that is a special case of causes or forces. Now, what we have done so far results in what we can call a three-level hierarchy of conceptual metaphors, where causes or forces is at the top, emotions are interactions of forces below it, and below that is anger is a pressurized substance in a container. Notice that all of them have to do with forces. Causes or forces is the most general one. Emotions are interactions of forces is less generic or more specific. And anger is a pressurized substance in a container is the most specific or least generic. But we can ask the following question at this point. Can these metaphors either singly or jointly account for the very specific contextual meaning of the metaphorical utterance in question? That is the metaphorical utterance we saw before. And what would be the contextual meaning in this example? Here is the example again. Everything that I wanted to say, I couldn't think how to say in French. I was bursting with anger, mostly at myself for my lack of French vocabulary. Should we say, would it be adequate to say that the contextual meaning is simply to be very angry? I believe clearly it would not be sufficient. The contextual meaning could be something like the speaker not being able to control her anger, or the speaker barely being able to control her anger. This is what bursting with anger really means, and not simply to be very angry. Now let's see how we can systematically account for this. As we know from Fauconnier's work on mental spaces, in every communicative situation, we build a mental space online. Now, given and furthermore, the kinds of mental spaces that we build online, for example, when we say sentences like this, the mental space that we build is typically based on the applicable frame. And the applicable frame in this case would be a metaphorically defined frame, namely anger is a pressurized substance in a container which has these mappings: substance to anger, container to angry person, pressure to intensity, resisting pressure to controlling intensity. However, notice that in this specific communicative situation, this is not sufficient, because the mental space that we build actually changes or elaborates on or modifies many of these, several of these mappings. So, for example, in the communicative situation where we build the mental space for this sentence, the angry person is the speaker of the sentence, that is the American woman in Paris. So there is a specific speaker here who happens to be an American woman, and not just any generic person. So this is already, a specification at the mental space level. Notice furthermore that the anger is directed at the speaker, that is the same person, the American woman, which we saw it was a non-prototypical case, because in the typical case, you direct your anger as someone who made you angry, but it's usually a different person from your own person. Notice that although the mapping of the pressurized container metaphor says that the pressure corresponds to intensity, but this mapping does not really say whether the mapping is low intensity or high intensity. There's nothing about that. It is only elaborated and specified in the given communicative situation, such that in this case, burst means that the intensity of the anger is very high. And finally, the angry person, who is the speaker, cannot control the intense anger. Notice that the mapping is simply in the frame of pressurized container. Resisting pressure corresponds to controlling intensity, but it does not really specify, the end result of this. The end result here is that the angry person cannot or can barely control the intense anger. So this leads to a very specific conceptual metaphor, which is given in red in the slide, which sounds somewhat strange. For those of us who have seen a large number of conceptual metaphors, the metaphor would be this: the speaker not being able to control her anger is this. Now comes this was the target domain, now comes the source domain, is for the container not being able to hold the pressure of the substance inside it. You can notice immediately that this is an extremely specific conceptual metaphor. And it is this highly specific conceptual metaphor that provides for the contextual meaning that the frame, the higher level pressurized container metaphor could not specify, let alone the still higher level emotions or forces domain level metaphor could not specify, not to mention causes or forces could not specify. So what we can see here is an interesting kind of hierarchy of metaphors, what we can call a schematicity hierarchy, a metaphorical schematicity hierarchy with causes or forces, which is at the image schema level. Emotions are interactions of forces, which is at the domain level. The domain level is emotions and physical forces. Anger is a pressurized substance in a container. That would be the frame level. And finally, at the mental space level, we would have this very bizarre looking, strange, but extremely rich and specific metaphor that elaborates on everything that we saw above it, the speaker not being able to control her anger. Notice that here we are talking about the speaker, the American woman specifically. We are talking about her anger. And that is conceptualized in the situation by the container as the container not being able to hold the pressure of the substance inside it. The question emerges, why do we need the mental space level in metaphor analysis? As we have seen, we need it because we can only account for the contextual meanings of metaphors at this level. We just saw how this can be explained. Now, furthermore, we need it because we can only account for the various pragmatic or rhetorical functions of metaphors here. And finally, for this talk, we can only account for the influence of context on metaphor selection here. There are several additional reasons for including the mental space level in metaphor analysis, but it is these three that I would like to deal with here in this talk. And the first one we can only account for the contextual meanings of metaphors at this level. We have seen, with the help of mental space theory, how this happens. Now, I would like to turn to the issue of how the same kind of account using mental spaces can give us the functions, the pragmatic or rhetorical functions of metaphors, and also an account of the influence of context on metaphor selection. So let us see a poem by Adrienne Rich, a very well-known American feminist poet. In her poem, The Phenomenology of Anger, she writes, "White acetylene ripples from my body, effortlessly released, perfectly trained on the true enemy, raking his body down to the thread of existence." This is not the full poem. This is just the part that interests us. What happens here is that the poet elaborates in a creative way on one of the well-known conventional conceptual metaphors. Actually, it is so well known that we just saw it a few minutes ago. Anger is a pressurized container. Anger is a substance in a pressurized container. Notice how she elaborates on this metaphor for rhetorical purposes. The substance in the container is specified as acetylene, a very dangerous substance. And notice how the eruption or the explosion of the container is elaborated somewhat differently, because it is not a spontaneous explosion without the target. It is a kind of explosion that is directed, that is pointed at what she calls the true enemy. So what is interesting about this is that at the mental space level, given the conventional frame level metaphor, anger is a pressurized pressurized substance in a container. On the mental space level, the poet can further elaborate on the metaphor and use it for some rhetorical purpose, or here maybe we should say poetic purpose, whatever it may be. Okay, now let's see another function that is performed here on the mental space level, which we can call narrative discursive function. This is a quote that comes from a therapist's paper. Edwards is the name of the therapist, and he is working on patients with emotional problems. And one patient, Jimmy, says, "I was boiling at this stage. I was real angry with Connie, and went up to bed, and I lay on the bed." Notice that he is using boiling, one of the linguistic manifestations of another well-known metaphor, which is anger is a hot fluid in a container. Now, to see the importance of the narrative discursive function, we must make an important distinction between two kinds of meaning in conceptual metaphor theory. One is meaning provided by the conceptual content. So if you only look at the anger is a hot fluid metaphor, and you look at the boiling as a metaphorical linguistic expression, you can say that boiling is an instantiation of this conceptual metaphor, and it corresponds to very intense anger, because the higher the heat level, the higher the level of anger, according to that metaphor. Now, however, metaphors can be said to have, or can be said to acquire, rather, certain discursive functions, as pointed out by the therapist. What are some of the discursive functions that the metaphor that the linguistic metaphor performs in this communicative act? Well, for example, justification for action would be one of those discursive functions, because by using "I was boiling at this stage" because of Connie's behavior in the pub, as it happens, the patient uses this metaphor in order to justify his or her actions, which later resulted in actual assaulting his wife. So by choosing boiling as a linguistic metaphor, he is, in the same breath, so to speak, provides justification for his action. Another discursive function is the statement of his or the expression of his passivity. It is, I was passive. I am passive because, there was this heated fluid inside me. And, that really made me, it happened in a way that I did not intend. It just, I was passive in relation or with regard to it. And as a result, I am not really accountable for what I did, because there was this boiling substance inside me, and its intensity was so strong that I had to apply, or I had to adjust my actions in relation to it. And as a result, I am not really accountable for it. So this is how we can see very clearly the distinction between conceptual content and discursive function. In therapy, I would imagine that this kind of distinction is really important. As far as conceptual metaphor theory is concerned, this is one of the neglected areas of the study of conceptual metaphors, namely that everything revolves around accounts of linguistic expressions, based on conceptual content and not on discursive function. But this is a very clear example that discursive function is just as important, and we can even go as far as to say even more important in the specific therapeutic situation than the conceptual content. Now, let's see the final issue, the issue of how context and metaphor use are connected. This is another neglected area of conceptual metaphor theory, and this is what I try to remedy in two books, Where Metaphors Come From and Extended Conceptual Metaphor Theory, that we should take the influence of context very, very seriously if we want to explain the emergence of particular conceptual metaphors and even the emergence of or the selection of particular linguistic metaphors. I have done several years of research on how the context can play a major role in the emergence of metaphors in communicative situations, and as a result of that research, I came up with 4 context types that are especially important in answering the question how contextual influence is highly relevant to the selection of metaphors in discourse situations. The 4 context types are situational context, discourse context, bodily context, and conceptual cognitive context. I have no time to go through all of this in detail. I just want to give you one short demonstration of this from situational context, and point out how the situational context, which is, for example, the physical environment or the cultural situation or the social situation, how that can influence the choice, unconscious choice, of course, of a particular linguistic or conceptual metaphor. The way this works is through contextual priming. Priming prepares a person for the selection of a particular metaphor in our case. And this is what I found. This is an example from a novel that I found on the internet. Excuse my, I think, Japanese, but I'm not sure. Ruji couldn't help but shout at Taiga to ease his anger, even though he was almost freezing. His anger was like a hot stove inside him. Okay, let's stop here. So what we can see here is that there is a situation. Obviously, this is the physical environment. It's very cold, and the person we are talking about, or the novelist is talking about, is almost freezing. However, his anger was like a hot stove inside him. So we basically have 2 frames in interaction here, being cold, which comes from the external physical environment, and being hot, that comes from the internal emotional environment, if we can say so. And it is the interaction between the 2 that results in a particular innovative, creative metaphor for anger, like his anger was like a hot stove. Well, the explanation, we all have intuitions about this could have happened. My intuition says that, obviously the anger is conceptualized as internal, heat inside the body, and we have the anger is a hot fluid in a container metaphor, and we have the anger is fire metaphor, where the fire is within the body as a container. And we have the external physical environment, which is extremely cold, and the person is almost freezing. And in order to handle your anger, and in order to handle your external freezing, you wish to have a hot stove. This is, of course, an imaginative interpretation, but my personal interpretation may coincide with some of your interpretations as well, and it results in the metaphor of hot stove. So on the one hand, we have the conventional metaphors in the background. In long-term memory, anger is fire, anger is a hot fluid. On the other side, on the other hand, we have the freezing external freezing temperatures outside, and in order to alleviate the external cold, you wish to have a hot stove, but probably there are many other ways of explaining how the hot stove metaphor for anger emerged here. If you have any ideas regarding this, they are most welcome. Some conclusions. With the changes to CMT that we made, the study of emotion concepts can also change. One major change is that conceptual metaphors are viewed as many-layered conceptual structures. This is what I call schematicity hierarchies. We have seen those for examples that come from the anger is a pressurized substance in a container metaphor. Secondly, examining the meaning of emotion metaphors also on the online mental space level can provide conceptually rich and highly specific characterization of meaning. So there is the issue of meaning which is given by particular frames or higher level metaphors, but those do not seem to correspond to the rich contextual meaning. So we need to add the mental space level to the analysis. The meaning of emotion metaphors does not consist of some conceptual content only, but also of some pragmatic function. We saw this very clearly in the case of the therapeutic metaphor of boiling. And finally, the study of contextual influence on metaphor production, that is the selection of metaphors in context, can explain why certain emotion metaphors are selected over others. And this is the hot stove case, where probably the non-linguistic situation, the freezing temperatures outside, may conceptually prime the person to come up with the hot stove metaphor. So these are some of the conclusions. And finally, I just want to say that the talk today was based on these 3 books. Well, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any comments or questions, I'm at your disposal.